The 9:15 from Paddington to Bath was known, among those who travelled regularly, as a train of impeccable punctuality and quiet respectability. It departed precisely on schedule, carried a clientele of professional gentlemen, well-dressed ladies, and the occasional clergyman, and arrived at its destination without fuss or incident. It was, in short, the very embodiment of English railway efficiency, a fact that made the events of that cold February morning all the more inexplicable. Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, a stout, sensible woman of 63 with a fondness for knitting and an aversion to melodrama, had boarded the train that morning with every expectation of an uneventful journey. She had secured a window seat in a first-class carriage, arranged her belongings with methodical precision, and settled in with her needlework and a thermos of strong tea. The compartment was otherwise empty, which suited her perfectly. As the train pulled away from Paddington, gathering speed through the grey London suburbs, Mrs. McGillicuddy hummed softly to herself and worked the needles with practised efficiency. She was bound for Bath to visit her dear friend Jane Marple, and she looked forward to several days of pleasant conversation and the excellent scones that Jane's housekeeper prepared. The train had been travelling for perhaps 20 minutes when another train appeared on the parallel track, moving in the same direction. For a brief moment, the two trains ran side by side, their speeds perfectly matched. Mrs. McGillicuddy glanced up from her knitting, idly observing the windows of the adjacent carriages as they flashed past. For what she saw in one of those windows froze the blood in her veins. In a first-class compartment directly level with her own, illuminated clearly by the morning light, a man's hands were locked around a woman's throat. The woman's face was contorted in terror and agony, her mouth open in what must have been a scream that Mrs. McGillicuddy could not hear. Her hands clawed desperately at the man's wrists. The man, tall, dark-haired, his face twisted with murderous intent, tightened his grip with brutal determination. Mrs. McGillicuddy watched, paralyzed with horror, as the woman's struggles grew weaker. Then, as suddenly as the vision had appeared, the other train pulled ahead, and the terrible scene vanished from view. For several moments, Mrs. McGillicuddy sat in stunned silence, her knitting fallen into her lap, her hands trembling. Then, galvanized into action, she lurched to her feet and made her way down the corridor to find the conductor. "There's been a murder," she gasped, catching the arm of a startled railway official. "On the other train. I saw it with my own eyes. A man strangling a woman." The conductor, a patient man named Hargraves, who had dealt with many eccentric passengers in his career, regarded her with polite skepticism. "A murder, madam. Are you quite certain?" "Of course I'm certain. Do you think I imagine such things? I saw it as clearly as I see you now. You must stop the train. The police must be notified." But when the conductor made inquiries at the next station, he returned with disappointing news. The other train, the 9:20 express to Reading, had been contacted. No one had reported anything amiss. All passengers had disembarked normally at Reading, and no bodies had been found. No complaints had been lodged. "Perhaps, madam," the conductor suggested delicately, "the light was deceptive? Or perhaps what you saw was exaggerated in the moment." Mrs. McGillicuddy drew herself up with considerable dignity. "Young man, I am neither hysterical nor fanciful. I know what I saw. A woman was murdered on that train." But no one believed her. 3 days later, in a comfortable sitting room in Bath, Mrs. McGillicuddy recounted her experience to Miss Jane Marple. The elderly lady listened with the careful attention she gave to all matters brought to her notice, her bright blue eyes thoughtful beneath their fringe of white curls. "And the police?" Miss Marple inquired gently, when her friend had finished. "The police were polite but utterly unconvinced," Mrs. McGillicuddy replied with bitter frustration. "They made inquiries, of course, but found nothing. No missing woman has been reported. No body has been discovered. They as good as told me I'd imagined it all." "But you did not imagine it." "Certainly not." Mrs. McGillicuddy's eyes flashed. Jane, I saw that woman die. I saw her face. I saw his hands on her throat. It was as real as you sitting before me now." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her fingers absently stroking the marmalade cat that dozed in her lap. "Then if a woman was indeed murdered," she said slowly, "where is the body? That is precisely the question that has tormented me these past 3 days. And if a body cannot be found, my dear Elspeth, the police can do very little. They are, after all, practical men who deal in evidence." She paused, then added thoughtfully, But there are those whose methods extend beyond the merely practical. Those who understand that a crime may be proved by the application of psychology and logic, even when physical evidence is elusive." "What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled. "I mean, my dear, that this matter requires someone with rather specialized talents. Someone who can reconstruct what happened through the careful analysis of human behavior and precise deduction. But who? I'm thinking of a gentleman of my acquaintance, a Belgian gentleman now retired and living in London. His name is Hercule Poirot." Mrs. McGillicuddy frowned. "The detective? But surely he only involves himself in affairs of great importance." "He involves himself," Miss Marple corrected gently, "in affairs that interest his remarkable intellect. And I rather think, my dear Elspeth, that a murder without a body, a crime that appears to have left no trace whatsoever, would interest him very much indeed." 4 days later, at precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy found herself seated in an impeccably appointed flat in a modern building overlooking the Thames. The sitting room was arranged with geometrical precision, cushions aligned at exact angles, books organized by height and color, a vase of flowers positioned at the mathematical center of a side table. Everything spoke of a mind that demanded order in all things. Hercule Poirot himself sat opposite her, a small egg-shaped man with a magnificent moustache that appeared to have been cultivated with the same meticulous care he applied to his surroundings. His eyes, green, intelligent, and deeply penetrating, regarded Miss McGillicuddy with an intensity that made her feel as though he could read every thought that had ever passed through her mind. "So, madame," he said, his accent lending a formal precision to his English, "you have witnessed a murder, but there is no body, no missing person, no evidence that this crime has occurred. The police naturally do not believe you." "That is correct, Mr. Poirot." "But you are certain of what you saw?" "As certain as I have ever been of anything in my life." Poirot nodded slowly, his fingers forming a cathedral beneath his chin. "Then we have before us a most interesting problem. A murder has been committed. Of that, I think, there can be no doubt. For you, madame, strike me as a woman of excellent sense and observation. But the murderer has contrived to dispose of all evidence. The body has vanished. There is no investigation because, officially, there has been no crime. Then you believe me. But naturally, madame. The little grey cells," he tapped his forehead significantly, "they tell me that your account has the ring of truth. You describe what you saw with precision, without embellishment, without melodrama. This is not the testimony of a woman who imagines things. None, this is the testimony of a reliable witness to a terrible act." Mrs. McGillicuddy felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Then you'll take the case?" "I will do more than that, madame. I will solve it." He rose to his feet with surprising grace for a man of his rotund build. "But first, we must understand exactly what happened. You will please to describe for me, with the utmost precision, everything you observed, every detail, no matter how small. Hercule Poirot, and he must know all." And so Mrs. McGillicuddy, with Poirot occasionally interjecting quiet questions, recounted her experience once more. She described the parallel trains, the perfect alignment of the windows, the duration of the sighting, no more than 10 seconds, she estimated. The appearance of the man, tall, dark-haired, though she had not seen his face clearly. And most vividly, the face of the woman, blonde, perhaps 30 years old, elegantly dressed, her expression frozen in terminal terror. When she had finished, Poirot was silent for several moments, his eyes half closed in concentration. "The train from Paddington departs at 9:15, he murmured. "The express to Reading leaves at 9:20. They would run parallel, yes, for a brief stretch between Willesden and Acton. But then the tracks diverge. This gives us, madame, a very specific location for the murder." He opened his eyes and fixed Mrs. McGillicuddy with a penetrating stare. "Tell me, madam, the woman who died, did she see you?" Mrs. McGillicuddy started at the question. I don't know. Her eyes were wide, but whether she actually saw me through the window, I cannot say. It is of no matter. The murderer. Did he see you? I don't believe so. His attention was entirely focused on what he was doing. Excellent. Then he does not know there was a witness. This, madame, is our advantage. Poirot began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Now we must ask ourselves the essential questions. If a woman was murdered on a train, where is the body? The murderer had perhaps 15 or 20 minutes before the train reached Reading. In that time, how he must dispose of a body from a moving train in broad daylight without being observed by other passengers or railway staff. "It seems impossible," Mrs. McGillicuddy said. "It seems impossible, yes. And yet it was done. Therefore, madame, we know something very important about our murderer. He's a man of considerable ingenuity and ruthless determination. He planned this crime with care. The body did not simply vanish. It was hidden or disposed of, according to a premeditated plan." Poirot ceased his pacing and turned to face her. "I will need your assistance, madame, for one more task. Tomorrow you will retrace your journey. I will accompany you. We will travel on the 9:15 from Paddington, and you will show me precisely where this murder occurred. Then Hercule Poirot will know where to search." "Search? But the police have already searched." A small smile played across Poirot's lips. "The police, madame, did not know where to look. But Poirot, he knows that a body thrown from a moving train does not travel far. It falls somewhere along that stretch of track between Willesden and Acton. And if it fell there," he paused significantly, "it is there still, waiting to be found." Mrs. McGillicuddy felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean the body has been lying there all this time?" "Not lying on the railway embankment, non. That would have been discovered immediately. But consider, madame, along the railway line there are places where a body might fall and not be immediately visible. Bushes, perhaps, a ditch, or—" His eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "A property that backs onto the railway line. A garden, perhaps, and overgrown and neglected. A place where no one would think to look." "Good heavens!" Mrs. McGillicuddy breathed. "Indeed, madame. And so tomorrow we begin our investigation properly. We will find where this unfortunate woman fell, and then we will find who killed her and why." He rubbed his hands together with evident satisfaction. For Hercule Poirot, he does not accept that a murder can be committed with such impunity. The little grey cells, they will unravel this mystery. Justice will be served. As Mrs. McGillicuddy took her leave, escorted to the door with old-world courtesy, she felt for the first time since that terrible morning a sense of hope. The woman she had seen die would not be forgotten. Her murderer would not escape. Behind her, in his precisely ordered sitting-room, Hercule Poirot stood at the window, gazing out at the grey London skyline. His expression was thoughtful, his magnificent moustache twitching slightly as he considered the problem before him. "A murder without a body," he murmured to himself. "But there is always a body, somewhere. And where there is a body, there is evidence. And where there is evidence—" He smiled, a smile of supreme confidence. "There is Hercule Poirot." The game, as they say, was afoot. The following morning dawned grey and cold, with a thin mist hanging over London that seemed to muffle all sound. Mrs. McGillicuddy arrived at Paddington Station at 9 o'clock precisely, as instructed, and found Hercule Poirot already waiting on the platform. He was dressed impeccably in a dark overcoat and carried a silver-topped walking stick, looking more like a prosperous banker than a detective embarking on a murder investigation. "Ah, Madame McGillicuddy." He greeted her with a small bow. "You are punctual. This is excellent. Punctuality, it is the politeness of princes, as they say. Now, we shall board this train and you will show me exactly where you were seated and exactly what you observed." They settled into a first-class compartment identical to the one Mrs. McGillicuddy had occupied on that fateful morning. Poirot insisted on positioning himself in the precise seat she had occupied, then gestured for her to sit opposite him. "Now, madam, you will narrate for me the journey as it occurred. We will time everything with exactitude." As the train pulled out of Paddington, Mrs. McGillicuddy found herself reliving that morning with uncomfortable clarity. Poirot sat motionless, his eyes closed, his fingers pressed together in concentration. He appeared almost to be asleep, but Mrs. McGillicuddy knew better. Behind those closed eyelids, his remarkable mind was at work, reconstructing the crime with methodical precision. "We are approaching Willesden," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "It was somewhere along here." Poirot's eyes snapped open. He leaned forward, gazing intently out the window at the passing landscape. The train ran through a cutting now, with embankments rising on either side. Buildings backed onto the railway line, the rear gardens of houses, some well-maintained, others overgrown and neglected. "The other train, it came alongside approximately here?" Poirot asked. "Yes, I believe so. And then for perhaps 10 seconds, we ran parallel." They both watched as another train appeared on the adjacent track, heading in the same direction. For a brief moment, the two trains matched speeds perfectly, and Mrs. McGillicuddy could see clearly into the windows of the other carriages. Then, just as before, the other train pulled ahead and the view was lost. "There!" Mrs. McGillicuddy exclaimed. "That is exactly how it happened." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the passing scenery. "And the body, if thrown from the train at that moment, would have fallen here." He gestured toward the embankment, where a thick tangle of bushes and brambles grew along a fence line. Beyond the fence, a large property was visible, a substantial house set back from the railway, its gardens extending down to meet the tracks. "Hart, we must discover who owns that property," Poirot murmured. "But first, we continue to Reading, just as the murderer did." The remainder of the journey was conducted in silence. Poirot's mind was clearly engaged with the problem, his brow furrowed in concentration. When they reached Reading, he consulted briefly with the station master, then returned to Mrs. McGillicuddy with a thoughtful expression. "It is as I suspected. The train makes no stops between Paddington and Reading. Therefore, the murderer had approximately 35 minutes alone with his victim after the deed was done. Time enough to search her belongings, to remove anything that might identify her, and to prepare her body for disposal." "But how could he dispose of a body without being seen?" Mrs. McGillicuddy protested. "These surely other passengers would have noticed." "The train, it was not full that morning, I have ascertained this. And a first-class compartment. One purchases privacy when one travels first class, n'est-ce pas? The corridor was likely empty. The murderer chooses his moment with care, opens the door, and the body falls onto the embankment. In the fog of that morning, at the speed the train travels, who would notice? By the time the train reaches Reading, there is nothing to see. The murderer disembarks like any other passenger, and the perfect crime is complete." "Except that I saw it happen," Mrs. McGillicuddy said quietly. "Precisely, madame. You are the single thread that will unravel his carefully woven plan." They returned to London on the next available train. Poirot was silent during the journey, but Mrs. McGillicuddy could sense the intensity of his concentration. As they parted at Paddington, he took her hand in both of his. "You have done well, madame. Now you must return to Bath and leave the matter in my hands. I will investigate this property that borders the railway line. If the body was thrown from the train where we believe, then it lies somewhere on those grounds. And when I find it, and I shall find it, then the investigation truly begins." Mrs. McGillicuddy departed, and Poirot stood on the platform, watching the crowds flow past him. His expression was grave. A woman had been murdered, her body hidden, her identity concealed. But the murderer had made one crucial error. He had assumed his crime was invisible. He had not counted on the careful observation of a sensible woman with excellent eyesight and an honest nature. And he had not counted on Hercule Poirot. The property that backed onto the railway embankment was called Rutherford Hall, and it belonged to a family named Crackenthorpe. Poirot discovered this through a combination of consultation with local property records and discreet inquiries at the nearest post office, where the postmistress proved remarkably forthcoming about the inhabitants of the large house. "Old Mr. Crackenthorpe lives there," she informed him, leaning across the counter with evident relish for gossip. "A difficult man, by all accounts. His wife died years ago, and he lives there now with his daughter Emma, who keeps house for him. The sons visit occasionally, but there's been some falling out in the family. Money troubles, I shouldn't wonder. There always is, and with families like that." Poirot absorbed this information with polite interest, then made his way toward Rutherford Hall. The house itself was substantial, but showed signs of neglect, paint peeling from the window frames, weeds growing through the gravel drive, an air of genteel decay that spoke of diminished fortunes and reduced staff. The grounds were extensive, running down to meet the railway embankment in a wilderness of overgrown shrubbery and untended flower beds. It would be, Poirot reflected, an excellent place to conceal a body. The question was how to gain access to search the property without arousing suspicion. He could hardly present himself at the front door and announce his intention to search for a corpse in the garden. As he stood contemplating this problem, a woman emerged from a side entrance of the house. So she was perhaps 50 years of age, dressed in sensible tweeds, with a capable, no-nonsense air about her. This, Poirot surmised, would be Emma Crackenthorpe, the daughter who kept house for her difficult father. "May I help you?" she called out, regarding him with polite curiosity rather than suspicion. "Are you lost?" Poirot approached with his most charming smile, raising his hat with continental courtesy. "Mademoiselle, 1,000 pardons for this intrusion. I am Hercule Poirot, and I find myself investigating a rather delicate matter. I wonder if I might impose upon your kindness to ask a few questions." "Hercule Poirot?" Emma's eyebrows rose. "The detective? Good heavens, what brings you to Rutherford Hall?" "A matter of some urgency, mademoiselle. I have reason to believe that a serious crime may have been committed, and that evidence relating to this crime may have fallen, as it were, onto your property from the railway line." Emma's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "What sort of crime?" "I fear it is murder, mademoiselle." For a moment, Emma simply stared at him. Then, with admirable composure, she said, "You'd better come inside, Mr. Poirot. My father is resting, but we can speak in the morning room." The interior of Rutherford Hall matched its exterior, faded grandeur, rooms too large and too numerous for the remaining inhabitants, furniture shrouded in dust sheets. Emma led him to a small, more comfortable room where a fire burned in the grate. "Now," she said, settling into a chair and regarding him with intelligent eyes, "please explain what this is about." Poirot recounted, with careful discretion, the essentials of Mrs. McGillicuddy's testimony. He did not mention her name, referring to her only as a reliable witness. He described the murder observed from the parallel train, the timing, the location. "And you believe," Emma said slowly, "that the body was thrown from the train and landed somewhere on our property." "It is a possibility I must investigate, mademoiselle." "Then you must certainly search. I'll have our gardener, Hillman, assist you, though I warn you, the grounds are extensive and much of them have been allowed to grow wild. We simply don't have the staff we once did." Poirot inclined his head gratefully. "You are most understanding, mademoiselle. Many would consider such a suggestion disagreeable." Emma's expression was grim. "Mr. Poirot, if a woman has been murdered and her body disposed of on our property, I consider it my duty to assist in finding her." "When did this occur?" 8 days ago, on the morning of February the 10th. 8 days, Emma murmured. "Then if there is a body, it has been lying out there all this time." She shuddered slightly, then recovered her composure. "I shall fetch Hillman immediately. He knows every inch of the grounds." Hillman proved to be a weathered man of 60, who received the news of their grim task with stolid calm. "There's the old long barn down by the railway embankment," he said thoughtfully. "Nobody's been in there for years, and there's thick undergrowth all along the fence line. If something was thrown from the train, that's where it would most likely land." "Then that is where we shall search," Poirot declared. And the three of them made their way through the overgrown gardens toward the railway embankment. The long barn loomed ahead, its door hanging loose on rusted hinges. Poirot's pulse quickened. His instincts, honed by years of investigation, told him they were close. Very close indeed. The long barn was a relic of more prosperous times when Rutherford Hall had maintained horses and carriages and required substantial storage for hay and equipment. Now it stood empty and forgotten, its roof sagging, its walls weathered to a silvery gray. Dead leaves had drifted against its foundation, and the small windows were opaque with grime and cobwebs. Hillman pushed open the protesting door, and the three of them stepped inside. The interior was dim and musty, filled with the detritus of decades: broken furniture, rusted tools, rotting sacks that might once have contained feed or fertilizer. Pale light filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating dancing motes of dust. "I haven't been in here for 2 years at least," Hillman said, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "Miss Emma wanted to have it torn down, but old Mr. Crackenthorpe wouldn't hear of it. Said it was part of the estate and must be maintained, though he never provided funds for maintenance." Poirot moved slowly through the barn, his keen eyes examining every shadow, every heap of debris. His expression was intent, focused. Emma and Hillman watched him with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "There," Poirot said suddenly, pointing with his walking stick toward the far corner of the barn. "What is that?" In the shadows, partially concealed beneath a pile of mouldering sacks, and something pale was visible, something that might have been fabric or... Hillman stepped forward and pulled away the sacks. Then he recoiled with an oath. It was a woman's body, lying on its side in an attitude that suggested it had been hastily thrust into the corner and covered. She was dressed in the remnants of what had once been an elegant traveling suit, dark blue wool, now stained and deteriorating. Her blonde hair, matted and discolored, fell across her face. One hand was visible, the fingers curled, and on one finger gleamed a ring set with what appeared to be diamonds. Emma gasped and turned away, her hand pressed to her mouth. Hillman stood frozen, his weathered face pale with shock. Only Poirot remained calm, though his expression had become grave and sad. "Do not touch anything," he said quietly. "The police must be summoned immediately. Miss Crackenthorpe, if you would be so kind as to telephone them. Tell them that Hercule Poirot has discovered a body and requests their immediate attendance." Emma nodded mutely and hurried from the barn. Poirot remained, studying the scene with meticulous attention. He did not approach the body closely, that would be for the police surgeon and the forensic experts, but even from a distance, certain details were apparent. The woman had been young, perhaps 30 years of age. Her clothing, though damaged by exposure and decomposition, had been expensive and fashionable. The position of the body suggested it had been moved post-mortem, dragged or carried to this location and concealed. And most significantly, there were marks on her throat, dark discolorations that confirmed Mrs. McGillicuddy's testimony. This woman had been strangled. "How did she get in here?" Hillman asked hoarsely. "The door. It's been locked for years." Poirot examined the door more closely. "Locked, you say? But the lock, it is broken. See here, this has been forced, and recently. The wood around the hasp, it shows fresh splintering. Then someone broke in to hide the body. Precisement. The murderer threw the body from the train as we suspected. It landed on the embankment, perhaps in the undergrowth. But a body lying in the open, it would be discovered quickly when the first railway workers passed. So the murderer, he must return. He waits until darkness, perhaps. Then he comes to this property, finds the body where it fell, and conceals it here, in this forgotten barn where no one ever comes. But that means," Hillman said slowly, "that the murderer knows this property, knows about this barn." Poirot turned to regard him with those penetrating green eyes. "Indeed. That is a most interesting deduction, Monsieur Hillman. The murderer is familiar with Rutherford Hall and its grounds. Perhaps very familiar indeed." Before Hillman could respond, voices were heard outside. Emma had returned with a police inspector and 2 constables. The inspector, a solid man named Craddock, regarded Poirot with a mixture of respect and exasperation. "Mr. Poirot, I might have known you'd be involved in something irregular. You found a body, I understand?" "More than that, Inspector. I found the victim of a murder that was witnessed but not believed. A murder that occurred 8 days ago on the 9:20 express from Paddington to Reading. The woman on the train?" Craddock's expression shifted to one of surprise. "We made inquiries about that report. Found nothing. Because you did not know where to look. But now, Maintenant, we have our victim. And with a victim, Inspector, we may begin to uncover her identity, her connections, and ultimately, her murderer." Craddock nodded grimly and directed his men to secure the scene. As the police went about their work, Poirot stood apart, his mind already racing ahead to the next phase of the investigation. A woman had been murdered. Her body had been found. Now the real work would begin. The identification of the body proved more difficult than anticipated. The woman carried no purse, no identification papers, and nothing that might reveal her name or origins. Her clothing labels had been carefully removed, and the jewelry she wore, the diamond ring and a gold bracelet, bore no distinguishing marks or engravings. Even her physical features, though still discernible despite 8 days of exposure, matched no missing person report in the police files. "It is as I suspected," Poirot said to Inspector Craddock 2 days later, as they sat in the inspector's office reviewing the meager facts. "The murderer, he has been most thorough. He has removed every trace of her identity. This was not a crime of passion, Inspector. This was planned, calculated, deliberate." Craddock consulted his notes with a frown. "The medical examiner confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, time of death consistent with the morning of February 10th. And the woman was approximately 30 years of age, well-nourished, in good health prior to her death. She had given birth at least once. There are the telltale marks. And there's something else." He paused significantly. "She was pregnant, approximately 3 months." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Indeed, that is most interesting. A woman expecting a child, murdered on a train. There is passion here after all, Inspector, beneath the careful planning. A crime of desperation, perhaps." "What about the connection to Rutherford Hall?" Craddock asked. "You said the murderer must know the property." "Without doubt. Consider the facts. The body falls from the train onto the embankment. The murderer cannot leave it there to be discovered. But how does he know of the long barn? How does he know it is abandoned, forgotten, the perfect hiding place? So he must be familiar with the property, must have access to it or knowledge of its layout. Then we should investigate the Crackenthorpe family." "Most certainly. Tell me what you have learned of them." Craddock consulted another file. "Old Josiah Crackenthorpe is 83, a widower, reportedly very wealthy but extremely miserly. He has 4 surviving children. The eldest son, Edmund, was killed in the war. The second son, Cedric, is 52, lives in London, works as an art dealer, not very successfully by all accounts. The third son, Harold, is 49, a businessman in the city, married with 2 children. The fourth child is Alfred, 45, unmarried, bit of a black sheep. He emigrated to Australia years ago, but returned to England about 6 months ago. And finally, there's the daughter, Emma, who we've met. She's 47, never married, lives at the Hall and cares for her father. And the old man's will? Ah, there's the interesting part. Josiah Crackenthorpe made his fortune in railways. Appropriate, given our circumstances, and he's sitting on a considerable estate. But he's one of those difficult old men who uses his money to control his children. None of them receive adequate allowances, and they're all waiting for him to die so they can inherit. The will divides the estate equally among the surviving children. Poirot steepled his fingers beneath his chin. So each child has a financial motive to preserve their share of the inheritance. If one of them were to die before the old man, their portion would be divided among the survivors. Say, and if one of them had contracted a marriage that might produce an heir. You think the dead woman was married to one of the Crackenthorpe sons? It is a possibility that bears investigation. A secret marriage, perhaps. An unsuitable match that the family would oppose. And if there is a child, or a child expected, then that complicates the inheritance considerably. Craddock nodded slowly. We'll need to question all of them, find out their movements on the morning of February 10th. Indeed. But carefully, Inspector. Our murderer is clever and ruthless. He has already killed once to protect his interests. We must not alert him that we are closing in. That evening, Poirot returned to Rutherford Hall. Emma Crackenthorpe received him in the drawing-room, her face drawn with strain, and the discovery of the body had clearly affected her deeply. Mr. Poirot, have the police identified the poor woman? Not yet, mademoiselle. That is partly why I have returned. I must ask you some questions about your family. Emma's expression became guarded. My family? Surely you don't think— I think nothing yet, mademoiselle. But the body was concealed on your property by someone who knew of the long barn. It is necessary to eliminate possibilities. I see. Emma clasped her hands tightly in her lap. What do you wish to know? Your brothers, mademoiselle. Tell me about them, their circumstances, their characters, their relationships. Emma hesitated, loyalty warring with honesty. Finally, she sighed. My brothers are not bad men, Mr. Poirot, but they are weak men. They have lived too long under our father's thumb, dependent on his money, waiting for him to die. It has corroded them in different ways. Go on. Cedric fancies himself an artist and an intellectual, but he has no real talent or discipline. He lives beyond his means and is constantly in debt. Emma continued, her voice quiet but steady. Harold is the respectable one, or so he likes to appear. He works in the city, has a wife and children, maintains the facade of success. But I know he has made poor investments. He comes to father regularly, asking for loans that never seem to be repaid. And Alfred— She paused, her expression troubled. Alfred is the most difficult to understand. He left for Australia 20 years ago after some scandal father never fully explained. When he returned 6 months ago, he was different, harder, more secretive. He stays in London most of the time, visits father occasionally, but never explains what he does or how he supports himself. Poirot absorbed this information with careful attention. And on the morning of February 10th, do you know where your brothers were? Cedric was here, actually. He'd come down the evening before to ask father for money, the usual pattern. Harold was presumably in London at his office. Alfred, I have no idea. As I said, he comes and goes without explanation. And you, mademoiselle, you were here that morning? Yes, as always. I rarely leave the hall. Someone must manage the household and attend to father's needs. There was no bitterness in her voice, only resignation. Your father, he's very wealthy. He controls considerable assets, yes. But he dispenses money grudgingly, even for necessities. He believes it keeps us dependent, and keeps us attentive. He's probably right. She met Poirot's eyes directly. You're thinking about the inheritance, aren't you? You're wondering if one of my brothers killed that woman to protect their share. It is a theory that must be considered. Then you should know something else, Mr. Poirot. 2 years ago, father had his solicitor draw up a new provision to his will. If any of his children were to marry or produce a child after the will was made, that child would be entitled to a share of the estate equal to what each of father's children receives. He did it to discourage what he called fortune hunters. He was convinced that people would marry us only for his money. Poirot's eyebrows rose. That is most significant information, mademoiselle. So if one of your brothers had contracted a secret marriage and his wife was expecting a child, that child would inherit a fifth of father's estate, reducing what each of us receives. For someone desperate for money, that would be a powerful motive for murder. Yet you tell me this, knowing it casts suspicion on your brothers. Emma's expression was weary but resolute. Mr. Poirot, a woman has been murdered and her body hidden on our property. If one of my brothers is responsible, he must face justice. I will not protect a murderer, even if he is my own blood. Poirot regarded her with approval. You are a woman of integrity, Mademoiselle Crackenthorpe. That is rare and admirable. After leaving Emma, Poirot requested a meeting with old Josiah Crackenthorpe himself, and he was led to a stuffy bedroom where the patriarch held court from his bed, though Poirot suspected the old man was capable of rising if he chose. Josiah was a wizened creature with sharp, malevolent eyes that suggested his mind remained formidably acute despite his aged body. So you're the foreign detective, Josiah said without preamble, his voice surprisingly strong. Emma says you found a dead woman in my long barn. What's that got to do with me? Perhaps nothing, monsieur. Perhaps everything. That depends on who she was and why she died. Police think it's connected to my family, do they? Think one of my wastrel sons killed her? The old man's eyes glittered with something that might have been malicious amusement. Wouldn't surprise me. They're all capable of it in their way. Weak men do desperate things. You have little faith in your children. I know them, that's all. Cedric's a fool who thinks he's clever. Harold's a pompous ass who's made a hash of his finances. And Alfred... He paused, wheezing slightly. Alfred's a mystery, even to me. Came back from Australia with money in his pocket, but won't say how he got it. Probably something shady. And if one of them had married secretly? Had a child? Josiah's expression hardened. Then that child would get what's coming to it under my will. I made sure of that. Let 'em all fight over it after I'm gone. Serves them right for wishing me dead. Poirot left Rutherford Hall with much to consider. The Crackenthorpe family was a nest of resentments, financial desperation, and carefully cultivated grievances. Thus, any one of the sons might have reason to prevent a secret wife and child from claiming their inheritance. But which one? And how to prove it? The answer, Poirot knew, lay in identifying the victim. Once they knew who she was, they would know whom she was connected to. And that connection would lead inexorably to her murderer. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. 3 days after the body's discovery, Inspector Craddock received a telephone call from a Mrs. Dorothy Blackwell, a landlady in Hammersmith who had read about the unidentified woman in the newspapers. She believed the description matched a young woman who had been lodging with her until mid-February. Poirot accompanied Craddock to the boarding house, a respectable establishment in a quiet street. Mrs. Blackwell was a brisk and observant woman who clearly took pride in knowing her tenant's business. Mrs. Martine Dubois, she called herself. Mrs. Blackwell explained, leading them to a small, neat room on the second floor. French, or so she said, though her accent seemed put on to me. She took the room in November, paid a month in advance, kept to herself mostly. Pleasant enough, but secretive. When did she leave? Craddock asked. That's just it. She didn't properly leave. On February 9th, she told me she'd be away for a few days, visiting friends in the country, paid her rent through the end of the month, and said she'd collect her things when she returned, but she never came back. Poirot examined the room with meticulous attention. The wardrobe contained modest clothing, nothing expensive. The dressing table held cosmetics, hairbrush, a few cheap novels. But in the drawer of the bedside table, Poirot found something of interest. Letters, tied with ribbon, addressed to Mrs. Martine Dubois. "May we examine these?" he asked. Mrs. Blackwell nodded. "The police have a right, I suppose. Poor thing, if that's her they found." The letters were love letters, passionate and indiscreet, though they bore no signature. The handwriting was educated, the sentiments extravagant. The writer spoke of his devotion, of obstacles that prevented their being together openly, of plans for the future once certain difficulties were resolved. The most recent letter, dated January, mentioned a meeting planned for February 10th. "The day of the murder," Craddock observed grimly. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And see here, Inspector, the writer speaks of meeting her on the usual train. He travelled frequently between London and Bath on business, he says. The Reading train would be the logical route. So she boarded the train to meet her lover, and he killed her. So it would appear. But why? What were these obstacles he mentions? What difficulties needed resolving?" Poirot carefully examined the postmarks on the envelopes. These were posted from London, various districts. He was careful not to use the same post office twice. A cautious man, our letter writer. Mrs. Blackwell provided one more crucial piece of information. She was expecting, you know. I could tell, having had 3 myself. She tried to hide it with loose clothing, but I noticed. And that's probably why she was so secretive, an unmarried woman in her condition. After securing the letters as evidence and arranging for Mrs. Blackwell to formally identify the body, Poirot and Craddock returned to Scotland Yard. The identification was positive. The woman in the long barn was indeed Martine Dubois, though that name was almost certainly an alias. "Now we must identify the letter writer," Poirot said, spreading the letters across Craddock's desk. "He is undoubtedly our murderer, and I believe, Inspector, that he is one of the Crackenthorpe brothers." "Based on what evidence?" "Logic, my friend. Consider, Martine Dubois was pregnant. Her lover speaks of obstacles to their marriage, difficulties to be resolved. What obstacles would prevent a free man from marrying the woman carrying his child? But a man whose inheritance would be jeopardized by producing an heir, that is a different matter entirely." Craddock studied the letters thoughtfully. "We'll need handwriting samples from all 3 brothers. But even if we match the handwriting, it only proves he wrote her love letters. We need evidence he was on that train." "Indeed. We must reconstruct the movements of Cedric, Harold, and Alfred Crackenthorpe on the morning of February 10th. One of them took the 9:20 express from Paddington to Reading. One of them sat in a first-class compartment with Martine Dubois. And one of them strangled her when she refused to— what? Disappear? Give up the child. We shall discover the truth." Poirot paused, his expression grave. "There is something else that troubles me, Inspector. The disposal of the body shows intimate knowledge of Rutherford Hall. The murderer knew of the long barn, knew it was abandoned, knew he could conceal the body there. This suggests he had been to the property recently, had observed the grounds. Perhaps he grew up there. Perhaps. Or perhaps he had another reason to familiarize himself with the estate. But that, Inspector, is a question we shall answer when we confront our murderer." Poirot's eyes glinted with determination, and confront him we shall, very soon indeed. The process of obtaining handwriting samples from the 3 Crackenthorpe brothers proved both revealing and frustrating. Cedric provided his sample with theatrical disdain, Harold with pompous indignation, and Alfred with sullen reluctance. Each protested his innocence, each claimed to know nothing of Martin Dubois, and that each had what appeared to be an alibi for the morning of February 10th. Cedric claimed he had been at Rutherford Hall, sleeping late after a quarrelsome dinner with his father the previous evening. Emma confirmed he had been present at breakfast at 9:30. Harold insisted he had been at his office in the city from 8 o'clock onward, with his secretary able to vouch for his presence. Alfred stated he had been at his lodgings in Bloomsbury, though he could provide no witness to corroborate this. The handwriting analysis, when it came, was inconclusive. The expert reported that the letters could have been written by any of the three brothers. All had similar education, similar penmanship training, and the love letters showed signs of deliberate disguise in the handwriting. "We are at an impasse," Craddock said in frustration, "since without definitive proof, we cannot charge any of them." Poirot, however, appeared unperturbed. "An impasse for the police, perhaps, Inspector, but not for Hercule Poirot. The little grey cells, they tell me something is not quite right with these alibis. They are too convenient, too neatly arranged. We must look deeper." He began by questioning Emma more thoroughly about Cedric's presence that morning. "You say he was at breakfast at 9:30, but the murder occurred at approximately 9:35, on the train. Could he have left the house between 9:30 and, say, 10 o'clock? Emma considered carefully. "I suppose he could have. After breakfast, I attended to Father and then went to speak with Cook about the day's meals. I didn't see Cedric again until lunchtime. He said he'd been in the library reading, but I didn't verify that. So he had opportunity. And the train station, how far from Rutherford Hall? A brisk walk of 15 minutes. One could easily reach it from here." Next, Poirot investigated Harold's alibi with equal thoroughness. A visit to Harold's office revealed that while Harold's secretary confirmed his presence that morning, she had not actually seen him until 10:15. He had sent word via a messenger boy that he would be working in his private office and was not to be disturbed until 10 o'clock. So for 2 hours that morning, Poirot mused to Craddock, Harold Crackenthorpe's whereabouts cannot be verified. He could have travelled to Paddington, boarded the 9:20 train, committed murder, and returned to his office by 10:15. But why would his secretary lie? She does not lie, Inspector. She simply reports what she was told. Harold is clever. He created an alibi that appears solid but has a significant gap. Alfred's situation was different. He had no alibi at all, made no attempt to construct one, and showed no concern about this fact. When pressed, he merely shrugged and said, "I was alone. I often am. If that makes me a murderer, arrest me." This very indifference intrigued Poirot. "A guilty man protests his innocence," he observed. "An innocent man does the same, but a man who does not care what we think, that is unusual." The investigation might have stalled entirely had not Poirot received an unexpected visitor at his flat. It was a young woman, poorly dressed but respectable, who introduced herself as Miss Janet Sims, formerly lady's maid to Martin Dubois. "I read in the papers that she's dead, sir," Janet said, she twisting her handkerchief anxiously. "I thought I ought to come forward, though I'm frightened too." "Frightened of what, mademoiselle?" "Of him, sir, the gentleman she was involved with. She never told me his name, but I saw him once, meeting her in the park. She didn't know I'd followed her. I was worried about her, you see. She'd changed so much, become so secretive and anxious. And this gentleman, can you describe him?" Janet's description was frustratingly vague. A tall man, well-dressed, dark hair going grey at the temples. It could have matched any of the three brothers. But then she added something significant. "He had a distinctive walk, sir, stiff-like, as if his back pained him, and he carried a walking stick with a silver handle shaped like a dog's head." Poirot sat forward with sudden intensity. "A walking stick? That you are certain?" "Yes, sir, very certain. It was unusual, that handle. I noticed it particularly." After Janet departed, Poirot immediately telephoned Emma Crackenthorpe. The walking stick with the dog's head handle. Who in your family possesses such a thing? There was a pause. Then Emma's voice came, tight with strain. That was my brother Edmund's stick. He carried it always, before he was killed in the war. After his death, it was kept in the hall stand as a memorial, but it's been missing for months. I assumed one of my brothers had taken it. Which brother, mademoiselle? I don't know, Mr. Poirot. I truly don't know. Poirot stood before the fireplace in his apartment, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes focused on some distant point as he marshaled his thoughts. Inspector Craddock sat waiting patiently, like knowing better than to interrupt when the little Belgian detective was in the throes of his mental processes. "We have been approaching this problem incorrectly," Poirot announced suddenly. "We have assumed that one of the three brothers is guilty, and we have been trying to determine which one. But what if we have been asking the wrong question?" "What do you mean?" "Consider, Inspector, what we know with certainty. Martine Dubois was murdered on the train. Her body was thrown onto the embankment at Rutherford Hall. The murderer knew of the long barn and returned after dark to conceal the body there. He possessed Edmund Crackenthorpe's walking stick. He wrote passionate love letters, speaking of obstacles and difficulties, and Martine was carrying his child. We know all this. But we have not examined what these facts tell us about the murderer's state of mind. He loved this woman enough to write her fervent letters. Yet he killed her. Why? Not from lack of affection, but from necessity. Something had changed. Some circumstance made her existence intolerable to him. Craddock frowned. The inheritance, surely. If old Josiah died, the child would claim a share. But Josiah Crackenthorpe is 83 years old and in declining health. He might die at any time. If the murderer could simply wait, perhaps a year, perhaps 2, the problem would resolve itself. Once the estate was settled and distributed, a child born afterward would have no claim. Why not wait? Perhaps he couldn't afford to wait. Perhaps his debts were too pressing. Perhaps, Poirot agreed. Or perhaps, and this is what troubles me, there is something we have not yet understood about the situation, some element that made immediate action necessary. He began to pace, his highly polished shoes making soft sounds on the carpet. Let us consider each brother in turn. Cedric, artistic, impractical, always in debt. He could have met Martine through his bohemian circles in London. A romantic affair, a secret marriage perhaps, and then the realization that a child would complicate his inheritance. The timing fits. But does the character fit? Cedric is weak, not ruthless. Harold, then, the respectable businessman with financial troubles. Harold is methodical, careful, concerned with appearances. If he had contracted a secret marriage, he would have handled it discreetly. Divorce, perhaps, or a settlement. The murder on a public train is not Harold's style. Too risky, too likely to cause scandal. That leaves Alfred. The mysterious Alfred, who lived in Australia for 20 years and returned with unexplained money. Alfred who provides no alibi and seems unconcerned by our suspicions. Alfred who is, as Emma says, harder and more secretive than he once was. Poirot paused in his pacing. Yes, Inspector, Alfred is interesting indeed. The following morning, Poirot and Craddock paid a visit to Alfred Crackenthorpe's lodgings in Bloomsbury. The landlord, when questioned, revealed that Alfred kept irregular hours, often departing for days at a time without explanation. His room, when they entered it with the landlord's permission, was austere and impersonal, almost as if Alfred was prepared to leave at a moment's notice. But in a locked drawer, which Craddock, exercising his authority, had opened, they found something extraordinary. A passport made out to Martin Dubois, with Alfred's photograph. And beside it, a marriage certificate dated 6 months earlier, recording the marriage of Alfred Crackenthorpe to Martine Lenoir in a registry office in Paris. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed. Martin Dubois, Martine Dubois. She took the feminine form of his alias. They were married in France under assumed names. But why the secrecy? Why the false names? Poirot's eyes gleamed with understanding. Because Alfred Crackenthorpe had something to hide. Something that made a public marriage impossible. Inspector, we must investigate Alfred's years in Australia, and I suspect we will find the answer there. A telegram to the Australian authorities produced results within 48 hours. Alfred Crackenthorpe had indeed lived in Australia, but not under his own name. He had called himself Martin Dubois and had worked as a clerk in Melbourne. More significantly, he had been married there to a woman named Rose Henderson. That marriage had never been dissolved. Bigamy, Craddock said grimly. He was already married when he wed Martine in Paris. Precisely. And when Martine became pregnant and began insisting on returning to England, on making their marriage public so their child would be legitimate, Alfred realized his situation was impossible. He could not acknowledge her as his wife without revealing his earlier marriage. He would be prosecuted for bigamy. His inheritance would be forfeit. And so, he decided she had to die. Not only die, but disappear so completely that no questions would be asked. Hence the removal of all identification, the careful disposal of the body. He hoped she would never be found, or if found, never identified. But Mrs. McGillicuddy witnessed the murder. Poirot nodded gravely. The one element Alfred could not anticipate, the single thread that unraveled his perfect crime. With the evidence of Alfred's bigamy established, Inspector Craddock obtained a warrant for his arrest. However, when they arrived at his Bloomsbury lodgings, Alfred had vanished. The landlord reported he had left the previous evening with a single suitcase, saying nothing about his destination. A check of the ports and railway stations was immediately instituted, but Poirot suspected Alfred had gone to ground somewhere in London, waiting for an opportunity to flee the country. "He knows we are closing in," Poirot said. "A man does not maintain a false identity and keep a packed suitcase unless he is prepared for flight. Alfred has been living on the edge of discovery for years. He has contingency plans." "Then how do we find him?" Poirot considered. "We do not find him, Inspector. We make him come to us." That evening, Emma Crackenthorpe received a telephone call from Poirot, requesting an urgent meeting at Rutherford Hall. When she inquired as to the purpose, Poirot explained that he had made a breakthrough in the case and needed to consult certain family documents held in old Josiah's study. "May I bring my brothers?" Emma asked. "They have been anxious for news of the investigation. But naturally, mademoiselle, it would be most helpful to have the entire family present." The trap was set. Poirot knew that if Alfred was monitoring the family, and a man as cautious as he would certainly maintain surveillance, news of this meeting would reach him, and Alfred, desperate to know how much Poirot had discovered, would be unable to resist attending. The following evening, Poirot and Inspector Craddock, accompanied by 2 plainclothes constables, arrived at Rutherford Hall. Emma received them in the drawing-room, where Cedric and Harold were already present, both looking apprehensive. Cedric affected his usual pose of artistic disdain, but his hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. Harold sat rigid and pompous, his face flushed with indignation at being summoned. Really, this is most irregular," Harold complained. "I had to cancel an important dinner engagement." "I apologize for the inconvenience, Monsieur Harold," Poirot said smoothly. "But I believe you will find this evening worth the sacrifice." They waited. 15 minutes passed. Then, as Poirot had anticipated, there was a sound at the French windows. Alfred Crackenthorpe stepped into the room, his face haggard, his clothes disheveled. In his hand, he held a revolver. "Nobody move," he said quietly. The weapon was steady, his eyes watchful. "I've come to hear what Poirot has to say, but at the first sign of treachery, I'll shoot." Emma gasped. Harold rose to his feet, sputtering protests. Cedric merely stared, his cigarette forgotten. Inspector Craddock tensed, but Poirot raised a calming hand. "There will be no treachery, Monsieur Alfred. You have come, as I knew you would, because you must know whether your secret is discovered. Very well. I will tell you. Yes, we know about your first marriage in Australia. We know about your bigamous marriage to Martine Lenoir. We know why you killed her." Alfred's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You met her in Paris, perhaps during one of your business trips. Business that I suspect was not entirely legal. You were lonely, and she was beautiful and charming. You married her under your alias, never intending for the marriage to become public. But then she became pregnant. She wanted to come to England, wanted her child to be born legitimately, wanted to be acknowledged as your wife." "She wouldn't listen to reason," Alfred said hoarsely. "I tried to explain why it was impossible, but she wouldn't understand. So she threatened to come to England anyway, to find my family, to expose everything. And so you arranged to meet her on the train. You had planned it carefully, a first-class compartment where you could be alone, a stretch of track running past Rutherford Hall where you could dispose of the body. You strangled her, removed all identification, and threw her from the train. Then, after darkness fell, you returned to the hall grounds, retrieved the body, and hid it in the long barn." "You're very clever, Poirot," Alfred said bitterly. "But cleverness won't help you now. I'm leaving England tonight, and none of you will stop me. You cannot escape, mon ami. The house is surrounded by police. Your only choice is surrender. I'll shoot my way out if I must." "Will you, and add more murders to your account?" Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "You killed once to protect your inheritance, your position, your carefully constructed life. But it gained you nothing. You are still hunted, still desperate, still doomed. The moment you pulled that trigger on the train, your life as you knew it ended. There is no escape from that truth." Alfred's hand wavered. The revolver lowered slightly. For a moment, Poirot thought reason might prevail. Then Alfred's expression hardened with resolve. "Better a bullet than the hangman's noose," he said, and raised the gun to his own temple. "Stop!" Poirot's command rang out with such authority that Alfred froze, the gun still pressed to his temple. "Before you take that final irreversible step, Monsieur Alfred, I ask you, do you not wish to know how completely you have been deceived?" Alfred's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Deceived? By whom?" "By the very woman you murdered. By Martine herself. She was not what she appeared to be, mon ami. And your crime, it was even more futile than you imagine." Despite himself, Alfred lowered the gun slightly. "What are you talking about?" Poirot stepped forward, his manner calm and assured. "When I investigated Martine's background in Paris, I discovered something most interesting. The woman you knew as Martine Lenoir had another name, another identity. She was born Martine Kellaway, daughter of a wealthy English industrialist who died 10 years ago. She inherited a considerable fortune, far more money than you could ever hope to gain from your father's estate." Alfred stared at him, incomprehension dawning into horror. "That's impossible. She was penniless. She lived in a shabby boarding house. Because she was hiding, Monsieur Alfred, hiding from someone, and I believe that someone was you." Emma leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Mr. Poirot, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Martine Crackenthorpe, for she did indeed marry Alfred legally, not in Paris as we thought, but here in England 2 years ago, discovered something about her husband that terrified her. She learned of his first marriage in Australia. She realized she had been deceived, that her marriage was a sham, and being a woman of intelligence, she also realized she was in danger." Poirot turned back to Alfred, his eyes penetrating. "She did not threaten to expose you, did she? Quite the contrary. She attempted to disappear, to hide from you using her maiden name. But you found her nonetheless. You could not allow her to live because she knew your secret. If she revealed your bigamy, you would lose everything, your inheritance, your position in the family, your freedom." "The child," Harold interjected suddenly. "Was there really a child?" "Ah, that is where the deception becomes most profound. There was no child, Monsieur Harold. The pregnancy was a fabrication, suggested to me by carefully placed evidence, the landlady's observations, certain items in Martine's room. But the medical examination revealed the truth. Martine had never been pregnant." Cedric stubbed out his cigarette with trembling fingers. "Then why would she pretend?" "Insurance," Poirot said simply. Martine knew Alfred was dangerous. She believed, mistakenly as it proved, that if he thought she carried his child, he might hesitate to harm her. She did not understand that for a man protecting a fortune, and even an unborn child becomes merely another obstacle to eliminate. Alfred's face had gone ashen. The revolver hung loosely in his hand, forgotten. She had money all along. Her own fortune? Indeed. I have the bank statements. Upon her death, her estate, some £50,000, was to be divided among several charities. You gained nothing from her murder, Monsieur Alfred. Nothing at all." The room fell into stunned silence. Then Alfred began to laugh, a terrible broken sound that held no humor. 2 years, he whispered. 2 years of planning, of watching, of waiting for the perfect moment. And it was all for nothing. "Not quite nothing," Poirot corrected gently. "You murdered an innocent woman who had done you no harm except to discover your lies. That, monsieur, is something indeed." The laughter died. And Alfred looked down at the gun in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. Then, with a gesture of infinite weariness, he let it fall to the carpet. "I loved her," he said quietly. "At first, at least, before the money, before the inheritance, before all of it became so complicated. I truly loved her. And yet you killed her. I had no choice. She would have ruined everything. There is always a choice, Monsieur Alfred. You chose your father's money over a human life. You chose deception over honesty. You chose murder over courage." Poirot's voice was stern, but not without compassion. "And now you must face the consequences of those choices." Inspector Craddock moved forward, the constables with him. Alfred offered no resistance as the handcuffs were fastened around his wrists. As he was led from the room, he paused at the doorway and looked back at his family, at Emma's stricken face, at Harold's disgust, at Cedric's stunned incomprehension. "I'm sorry," he said, though whether he addressed them or the ghost of Martine Dubois, no one could say. When Alfred had been taken away, Emma turned to Poirot, her face pale. "How did you know about Martine's fortune? How did you discover her real identity?" Poirot permitted himself a small smile. "The diamond ring she wore, mademoiselle. It was of exceptional quality, far too valuable for a woman living in a shabby boarding house. That inconsistency, it troubled me. And so I investigated further, and the truth revealed itself, as truth always does to those who search for it with sufficient diligence." 3 weeks later, Hercule Poirot sat in the drawing-room of Rutherford Hall, accepting a cup of tea from Emma Crackenthorpe's steady hands. The house seemed quieter now, though whether from the absence of Alfred or the lifting of long-held tensions, Poirot could not say. Outside, spring had begun to assert itself, and through the windows he could see the gardens showing signs of renewal. "The trial is set for June," Emma said, settling into her chair. "The solicitor says Alfred will plead guilty. There seems little point in contesting the evidence." "It is the wisest course," Poirot agreed. "The evidence against him is overwhelming. Mrs. McGillicuddy's testimony, the forensic evidence, the marriage certificates, his own confession. No jury would acquit him." "Will they hang him?" Poirot was silent for a moment. "That, mademoiselle, is for the court to decide. But yes, I believe it is likely. He took a life with premeditation and considerable planning. The law does not treat such actions lightly." Emma's hands tightened on her teacup. "He was not always a bad man, Mr. Poirot. As children, Alfred was kind, generous even. It was only after years under father's domination, years of financial dependence and humiliation, that he became what he became. You seek to excuse him? No. But perhaps to understand him. Is that wrong? It is not wrong, mademoiselle. It is human. And Hercule Poirot, he too seeks always to understand. The psychology of the criminal, it is as important as the evidence. He set down his cup with precision. Your brother made choices, yes, but those choices were shaped by circumstances, by your father's manipulation, by his own weakness, by a system that valued inheritance over integrity. These do not excuse murder, but they explain it. And Martine? What of her choices? Ah, the unfortunate Martine. She too made choices, some wise, some less so. She married a man without fully investigating his background. When she discovered his deception, she chose to hide rather than expose him. She invented a pregnancy, believing it would protect her. Each choice seemed logical at the time, yet each drew her closer to her doom. Emma gazed into the fire. Do you believe she knew at the end, when he put his hands around her throat? I believe she knew she had been found. Whether she understood that he intended murder rather than merely confrontation, that I cannot say. But yes, I think in those final moments she understood that her attempts to escape had failed. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments. Then Emma asked, what will happen to her fortune? The £50,000. It goes to the charities named in her will as she intended. A home for orphaned children, a hospital for the poor, a fund for widows. She was a woman of compassionate instincts, Mademoiselle Emma. Had she lived, she would have done much good with that money. At least some good comes from this tragedy, then. Some good, yes. And perhaps also a lesson. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes intent. Your father's will, with its provisions and restrictions, was designed to control his children even from beyond the grave. It has bred resentment, desperation, and ultimately murder. Money, mademoiselle, should liberate, not enslave. Emma's expression became thoughtful. Father is declining rapidly. The doctor says he may not last the summer. When he is gone, we will inherit at last, those of us who remain. Harold, Cedric, and myself. The fortune will be divided 3 ways instead of 4. And what will you do with your share? Leave this house, I think. It holds too many dark memories now. I shall find a cottage somewhere quiet, perhaps by the sea. I have spent my life caring for a man who showed me no gratitude. I should like to spend what remains caring for myself. She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her tired face. Is that selfish, Mr. Poirot? It is not selfish, mademoiselle. It is wisdom. As Poirot prepared to depart, Emma accompanied him to the door. The long barn was visible in the distance, its door now secured, its interior empty once more. Soon it would be demolished, Emma had told him. She could not bear for it to remain standing. Thank you, Mr. Poirot, she said quietly, for finding the truth, even though it was terrible. The truth is always necessary, mademoiselle, even when it brings pain. A murder unavenged, a crime unpunished, these are injustices that poison everything they touch. Now, at least, justice will be served, and the spirit of Martine Dubois may rest in peace. He walked down the drive toward the waiting taxi, his silver-topped cane tapping rhythmically on the gravel. Behind him, Rutherford Hall stood silent against the spring sky, a monument to pride, greed, and the terrible consequences of both. In his mind, Poirot was already organizing his notes on the case, arranging the facts with the same geometric precision he applied to his sitting room. The murder on the 9:15 from Paddington would take its place among his most interesting cases, not for its complexity, but for its revelation of human nature at its most desperate. A woman had loved unwisely. A man had chosen murder over honor. and between them a tragedy had unfolded with inexorable logic, like a mathematical proof moving toward its inevitable conclusion. Hercule Poirot settled into the taxi and permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. Justice had been served. Order had been restored. The little grey cells had triumphed once more. "To the station, if you please," he instructed the driver. "I have a train to catch." And as London appeared in the distance, Poirot reflected that trains would forever remind him of this case, of parallel tracks briefly converging, of witness and victim brought together by chance, like of a single moment of observation that had unravelled a perfect crime. The affair at Paddington Station was closed. The end.